Everyone in Willow Creek believed the quiet ranch hand had nothing to his name. They saw the worn coat, the cracked boots, and the tired horse he led through town. They saw a man asking for honest work and a place to sleep. But no one knew that the stranger repairing broken fences and carrying water beside a struggling widow was hiding a name that could change everything. And the day that name was finally spoken aloud, the woman who had trusted him more than anyone would have to decide whether a lie could ever be forgiven. The morning Silas Reed came to Willow Creek, the sky was the color of old steel. A cold wind moved across the open plains, carrying dust through the gaps in every wooden fence and pushing against the small ranch house that sat alone beyond the cottonwood trees. Margaret Ellis stood beside the kitchen window, watching the sunrise fight its way through the clouds. Her coffee had gone cold in her hands. She didn't notice. She had spent the last hour looking at the same thing she looked at every morning. The empty fields, the broken fence, the barn that needed repairs, and the small wooden box hidden beneath the table where unpaid bills waited like a storm that refused to pass. The Ellis Ranch had once been a place people admired. Her late husband, Thomas, had built it with his own hands. He used to say that a man didn't need the biggest land or the richest soil to build something worth keeping. He only needed patience. But patience did not stop a roof from leaking. It did not repair broken wagons. And it did not make creditors wait forever. Margaret folded the letter sitting beside her cup and placed it back inside the drawer. She already knew what it said. Another payment. Another warning. Another reminder that the ranch was slowly slipping away. Outside, her old mare whinnied. Margaret looked toward the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. People rarely came this far unless they wanted something. When she stepped outside, she saw a stranger standing near the front gate. A tall man. Dust covered his shoulders. His hat was pulled low against the wind. His coat looked like it had traveled more miles than he had. But there was something different about him. He wasn't standing there like a beggar. He wasn't standing there like a man looking for pity. He stood quietly waiting. Margaret walked closer but kept her distance. "Can I help you?" she asked. The stranger lifted his head. His eyes were calm but tired. "Name's Silas Reed," he said. "I heard you might need another pair of hands." Margaret studied him. "Who told you that?" Silas glanced toward the road. "No one had to." A small silence passed between them. The wind moved through the dry grass. Margaret crossed her arms. "You know this ranch doesn't pay much." "I'm not looking for much." Most men say that until they see the work. A faint smile touched his face. "Then I suppose I'll have to show you." That answer surprised her. Most strangers came with promises. This one came with patience. Margaret looked down at his boots. They were worn. His hands were rough. There were small cuts across his fingers, the kind a man earned from real work. "Not from pretending." "There is a small room above the barn," she said. "It isn't comfortable. I've slept in worse places. You'll eat with me if there's food." Silas nodded. "And if there's not?" Margaret looked at him. "Then we'll both be hungry." For the first time, the stranger smiled. "Fair enough." She opened the gate. "North fence needs fixing." Silas stepped inside. "Then I'll start there." He didn't ask about wages. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask why a woman was running a ranch alone. That caught Margaret's attention. By noon, she found herself watching him from the porch. Silas worked differently than the hired men she had known before. He didn't rush to look impressive. He didn't complain when the wood was harder than expected. He simply worked. Post by post. Nail by nail. Like every small repair mattered. When Margaret carried a bucket of water toward the fence, She found him already repairing a section she thought would need replacing. "You fixed that?" she asked. Silas looked over his shoulder. "Wasn't as bad as it looked." She looked at the fence. "It looked terrible." He nodded. "It did." That almost made her laugh. Almost. Instead, she handed him the bucket. "You always this quiet?" Silas took a drink. "Usually." "Why?" He looked across the fields before answering. "Sometimes a person hears more when they aren't the one talking." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't. But she remembered it. That evening, she made a simple supper. Beans, bread, a little meat saved from the week before. Nothing special. When she placed the bowl in front of him, Silas looked at it like someone had handed him something valuable. "You don't have to look so surprised," Margaret said. "I wasn't expecting a meal. You worked all day." Still, she sat across from him. "You know, most people don't thank someone for feeding them." Silas lowered his eyes. "Most people don't know what it means when someone does." The answer was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret noticed. But she didn't ask. Not yet. After supper, Silas stepped outside to check the horses. The night was cold. The stars were bright above the open land. Near the barn, tied beneath a tree, was his horse. At first glance, it looked like any other working animal. But someone who knew horses would have noticed the difference. The saddle was too fine. The leather too expensive. The animal too well trained. Silas rested a hand against its neck. "Not yet," he whispered. The horse shifted. Silas looked back toward the small ranch house. A warm glow came from the kitchen window. Inside sat a woman who had offered kindness without asking what she would receive in return. Something he had not experienced in a very long time. He reached inside his coat and touched the folded document hidden there. A document carrying a name he had spent weeks trying to escape. A name connected to one of the largest ranches in the territory. A name that opened doors. A name that made people change the way they spoke. Silas Reed was not the name written on that paper. The truth was much heavier. His real name was Everett Caldwell, owner of the Caldwell Valley Ranch. A man with hundreds of acres. A man with money most people in Willow Creek could never imagine. And yet, standing beside a poor barn under a cold sky, he felt more like himself than he had in years. The next morning, Margaret found him repairing the old water pump. She stopped near the porch. "You didn't have to do that." Silas looked up. "It was broken." "I know. So I fixed it." She watched him for a moment. Simple answer. No pride. No expectation. Just a man solving a problem. That afternoon, they went into town for supplies. Willow Creek was small, the kind of place where everyone knew who arrived and why. When Margaret entered the general store with Silas behind her, conversations became quieter. A man near the counter looked him over. Didn't know Margaret Ellis was taking in travelers now. Margaret turned. "He works." The man smiled. "That's what they all say." Silas stayed silent. Margaret placed the coins on the counter. "He has done more work in 3 days than most men do in 3 weeks." The store went quiet. The man looked away. Outside, Silas walked beside her carrying the supplies. "You didn't have to defend me." Margaret adjusted the basket in her hands. "Yes, I did." "Why?" She looked ahead. "Because people decide what someone is worth before they ever learn their story." Silas became quiet. Those words followed him the entire walk home. That night, Margaret found him sitting outside the barn. The wind moved softly around them. "You always sit alone?" she asked. Silas looked toward the dark fields. "Most of my life. By choice." A long pause. "At first." Margaret sat on the porch steps. "And now?" Silas looked back at the small house. The broken fence. The lantern glowing beside the door. "Now I'm not sure." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different. Not empty. Just waiting. Neither of them knew it yet, but the secret Silas carried would soon ride into Willow Creek on horseback. And when the truth arrived, the quiet trust growing between them would face its greatest test. Because a hidden name could explain everything. But it could also destroy everything. The days that followed changed the Ellis Ranch in ways Margaret never expected. Not because Silas Reed brought money. Not because he brought connections. Not because he promised some impossible miracle. He simply stayed. And for a woman who had spent years watching people leave when things became difficult, that meant more than she wanted to admit. Every morning before sunrise, Margaret would find him already awake. The first time it happened, she thought he had been unable to sleep. The second time, she assumed it was habit. By the end of the week, she stopped wondering. Silas was always there. Fixing the barn door. Repairing the broken wagon wheel. Checking the fences before the wind could knock them down again. He never acted like he was saving her. That was what made it different. He treated the ranch like it belonged to both of them. And Margaret noticed. She noticed the way he always left the best piece of bread on her plate when there wasn't enough. She noticed how he repaired things before she even asked. She noticed how he never walked into the house without knocking, even though he had been given permission to enter. Small things. Things most people ignored. But Margaret had learned that small things often told the truth. One afternoon, rain clouds gathered over Willow Creek. The first drops in weeks fell onto the dry ground, turning dust into dark patches of earth. Margaret stood near the barn, watching Silas cover the hay before the storm arrived. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Silas stopped for a moment. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Leaving here? Leaving anywhere?" He looked toward the distant hills. "I used to." "What changed?" Silas lowered the rope in his hands. "I found something I wasn't looking for." Margaret studied him. "What was that?" He looked at the ranch. The fields. The old house. The fence he had repaired. "Peace." The answer was simple. But something about the way he said it made Margaret look away. She understood loneliness. Maybe too well. That evening, the storm arrived. Rain hit the roof hard, and the wind pushed against the walls. The old ranch house shook with every strong gust. Margaret was lighting the second lantern when she heard a loud crack outside. Silas was already moving toward the door. "Stay inside," he said. She frowned. "Don't tell me what to do." A small smile appeared on his face. "Was worth trying." Despite herself, she almost smiled back. Almost. Together, they ran through the rain toward the barn. A section of the roof had broken loose. For the next hour, they worked side by side. Holding boards. Passing tools. Shouting over the storm. By the time they finished, both were soaked. Margaret laughed suddenly. Silas looked at her. "What?" She shook her head. "I can't remember the last time I laughed while fixing something." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile he usually gave. A real one. And for a second, Margaret saw the man beneath the quiet. Not the worker. Not the stranger, just a man who had forgotten what happiness felt like. The next morning, something unusual happened. A visitor arrived. A well-dressed man riding a fine black horse stopped at the edge of the property. Margaret recognized him immediately. Samuel Price, a businessman from Silver Creek. A man who had been trying to purchase her land for months. He removed his hat. Mrs. Ellis. Margaret stepped onto the porch. Mr. Price, I heard you have help now. Her expression remained calm. I do. Samuel looked toward Silas, who was repairing a fence nearby. Interesting. Silas glanced over but continued working. Samuel smiled slightly. Men like that usually don't stay long. Margaret's voice became colder. Maybe because people like you make them unwelcome. Samuel ignored the comment. I'm still willing to make you a fair offer. I already answered. Your answer won't matter when the bank comes for the land. The words hung in the air. Margaret's face changed slightly. Only for a second. But Silas saw it. Samuel noticed too. 30 days, isn't it? Margaret said nothing. Samuel put his hat back on. You should think carefully. After he rode away, silence returned. Silas walked closer. What was that about? Margaret picked up the basket beside the porch. Nothing. Silas looked at her. He knew it wasn't nothing. But he didn't push. Later that evening, Margaret found him sitting at the kitchen table. The same place where they had shared their first meal. A folded paper sat beside him. Her bank notice. She froze. You went through my things. Silas immediately stood. No. Then how did you see it? It was under the cup. Margaret looked away. For a moment she seemed tired. Not angry. Just tired. I was going to handle it. Silas nodded. I know. You don't. I do. She looked at him. How? The question was simple. But it carried something deeper. Silas had no answer. Because the truth was, he knew exactly how. He had spent years watching people struggle. People who worked harder than anyone he knew, but still lost everything. People who needed help, but refused to ask because pride was the only thing they had left. I've seen people lose everything because no one helped them in time, he said. Margaret's expression softened slightly. But you don't know me. Silas looked at her. No. A pause. But I want to. The room became quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the windows. Margaret looked down at the paper. I don't want someone fixing my life. Silas nodded. Then I won't. That surprised her. Most men would have argued. Most men would have tried to prove they could save the day. Silas simply accepted it. The following week, they worked harder than ever. But something had changed. Margaret began trusting him in small ways. She started leaving the kitchen door unlocked. She stopped apologizing when she needed help. She even started telling him stories about Thomas. The husband she lost. The man who built the ranch. The man who believed every person deserved a second chance. One evening while they sat outside watching the sunset, Silas asked quietly, Do you miss him? Margaret looked at the horizon. Every day. Then how did you keep going? She thought about it. I stopped waiting for life to become easier. Silas looked at her. What did you do instead? She smiled faintly. I learned how to carry what was heavy. Those words stayed with him. Because Silas had been carrying something heavy too. A secret. A name. A life he had walked away from. That night after Margaret went inside, Silas opened the small wooden box he kept hidden beneath his bed. Inside was a letter. The seal was from the Caldwell Valley Ranch, the largest ranch in the region. The letter began with words he had avoided reading for weeks. Mr. Everett Caldwell. He folded it again quickly. Because tomorrow morning, men from his old life would arrive in Willow Creek. And they would not call him Silas Reed. They would call him by the name he had tried to leave behind. The name that could change the way Margaret looked at him forever. The truth did not arrive quietly. It came riding across the open land with a cloud of dust behind it, carrying a name Silas had tried to bury. For weeks, Margaret Ellis had known him as the man who repaired fences with steady hands, the stranger who ate simple meals without complaint, and the quiet worker who never asked what she could give him. She believed she knew him. But on that morning, she would learn there was a part of him he had kept hidden from the very beginning. The day started like any other. Margaret was outside before sunrise, carrying a basket of tools toward the south field. The air was cold. The grass was silver with frost. Silas was already there, tightening the wire along the fence line. "You never sleep?" Margaret asked. Silas looked up. "I do." "When?" A small smile crossed his face. "When no one is watching." Margaret shook her head. "You are a strange man, Silas Reed." He lowered his eyes back to the fence. "Maybe." She stood there a moment. There was something different about him lately. He was quieter. Not the peaceful quiet she had grown used to. A heavier kind. Like he was carrying a thought too large to hold. Margaret wanted to ask. But she didn't. She had learned that some people only shared their pain when they were ready. By midday, the sky cleared. The ranch was quiet except for the sound of tools and the occasional call of birds across the fields. Then came the sound of approaching horses. Both of them looked up. 3 riders appeared on the hill. They were not travelers. Not farmers. Their clothes were too clean, their horses too well cared for. Silas stopped working. Margaret noticed. "You know them?" He didn't answer immediately. That was enough of an answer. The riders reached the fence and stopped. The man in front removed his gloves. His eyes went straight to Silas. "Mr. Caldwell." The world seemed to stop. Margaret looked at Silas. Silas did not move. The man continued. "We've been searching for you for almost a month." Margaret's hand slowly lowered from the fence post. "Mr. Caldwell." The name meant something. Everyone in the territory knew the Caldwell family. The largest ranch. The finest horses. The kind of wealth most people only heard about. Silas stepped forward. "James not here." The man looked around. Then at Margaret. His expression changed. A moment of realization. "She doesn't know." Silas's jaw tightened. "No." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Not because of the name. Because of the silence afterward. Because Silas had a chance to tell her. And he didn't. The rider looked uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to." "Leave," Silas said. The man hesitated. "Sir, your father has been waiting." Silas looked away. "My father can wait longer." The 3 men exchanged glances. Then James nodded. "We'll be in town." When they rode away, the silence they left behind felt heavier than any argument. Margaret turned toward the house. Silas followed. "Margaret." She stopped. Slowly she faced him. "Who are you?" The question hurt more than anger would have. Silas removed his hat. "My name is Everett Caldwell." She stared at him. "How long?" He swallowed. "Since before I walked through your gate." The disappointment on her face was worse than anything he expected. "You knew?" "Yes." "You knew who you were?" "Yes." "And you let me believe you were just a man looking for work." Silas looked down. "I didn't want to be that man here." Margaret laughed once. "But there was no happiness in it. That was your choice." He nodded. "Yes." She looked toward the fields. "The bank letters." Silas stayed silent. "Did you know about them?" "I saw the notice." "Could you have fixed it?" A long pause. "Yes." That answer hurt more. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Because that was the truth she had feared. Not that he had money. Not that he had a different life. But that every struggle she had carried alone was something he could have ended with a simple decision. "You watched me worry." "I know." "You watched me count every coin." "I know." "You sat at my table." His voice became quiet. "I know." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that feels like?" Silas had no defense. No excuse. Only the truth. "No." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's the problem." The wind moved between them. The same wind that had carried him to her gate. The same wind that had watched their first meal together. But now it felt different. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," Silas said. "I believe that." He looked surprised. "But you still did." Those words stayed with him. Because they were fair. And he knew it. Margaret walked toward the house. Silas didn't stop her. That was the hardest part. A younger version of himself would have tried to explain. Would have offered money. Would have found a way to make the problem disappear. But Margaret had taught him something. Some things could not be repaired with a check. Some things needed honesty. That evening, Silas packed his belongings. Not because he wanted to leave. Because he understood he had no right to stay. He placed the extra shirt Margaret had washed on the bed. The old coat she had given him hung beside the door. He touched the worn sleeve. A simple coat. Given by someone who believed he needed it. Not because of his name. Not because of his money. Just because she saw a man who was cold. Before leaving, he walked into the kitchen. The table was empty. The chair across from Margaret's was pushed in. He stood there longer than he should have. Then he placed a small envelope beside the lantern. Not money. Not a payment. Just a letter. Outside, Margaret watched from the window as he walked toward the barn. A part of her wanted to call his name. But she didn't know which name to use. Silas. Or Everett. The next morning he left before sunrise. No dramatic goodbye. No promises. Just a man riding away with the weight of what he had done. Days passed. The ranch became quiet again. Too quiet. Margaret returned to her routine. Wake before dawn. Work until dark. Eat alone. Sleep. But something had changed. She was angry. She was hurt. Yet she could not forget the man who had fixed her fence. The man who had listened. The man who had never once treated her like she was beneath him. Meanwhile, 2 days north of Willow Creek, Everett Caldwell stood inside a large office overlooking his family's ranch. The room was exactly as he remembered. Large desk. Expensive furniture. walls covered with maps, everything he had walked away from. His father looked across the room. You disappeared for weeks. Everett said nothing. You embarrassed this family. Still nothing. Finally, his father sighed. What did you find out there? Everett looked toward the window. He thought about the small kitchen, the chipped cups, the repaired fence, the woman who had offered him kindness when she had almost nothing herself. I found out I was wrong. His father studied him. About what? Everett answered quietly. About what makes someone valuable. For the first time in years, he ignored the expectations waiting for him. He ignored the business, the reputation, the easy solution. Because if he went back, he could not return as Everett Caldwell, the wealthy ranch owner who could buy forgiveness. He had to return as the man Margaret had known. The man who worked beside her. The man who sat at her table. The man who had finally learned that trust was worth more than a name. And before he could make that journey back to Willow Creek, one final choice waited. Would he use his wealth to save her ranch? Or would he finally respect her enough to let her choose? The answer would decide whether he had truly changed. For the first time in his life, Everett Caldwell understood that having everything did not mean he could fix everything. He had spent years believing money could solve any problem. A broken fence, a failed business deal, a difficult situation. But standing outside Margaret Ellis's ranch, he had learned something money could never buy. Trust. And once trust was broken, the only way to rebuild it was with patience. Not power. Not promises. Not a signature on a piece of paper. The journey back to Willow Creek took 2 days. Everett could have arrived sooner. He could have ridden one of his finest horses. He could have brought lawyers, bankers, and enough money to erase every debt Margaret carried. But he didn't. He rode the same old horse he had used when he first came to her gate. He wore the same worn coat. He carried no expensive gifts. No grand explanation. Only the truth. When the Ellis ranch appeared in the distance, Everett slowed his horse. The place looked exactly the same. The fence still had the repairs he made with his own hands. The barn still leaned slightly against the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney of the small house. But somehow it felt different. Because now he knew what it meant. This place had never been about land. It was about the people who gave meaning to it. Everett stopped at the gate. For a moment he simply sat there. Then he climbed down. Margaret saw him from the window. She had known he might return. She just didn't know if she wanted him to. When he walked toward the porch, she stepped outside. Neither of them spoke at first. The distance between them felt longer than the road he had traveled. Finally, Everett removed his hat. Margaret. She looked at him. This time, he used his real voice. No hiding. No pretending. Everett. The way she said his name told him she still wasn't ready to forgive. And he accepted that. I came to apologize. She remained quiet. I know I can't undo what I did. The wind moved through the trees. I know you trusted me, and I made you question whether that trust was real. Margaret looked away. You did. Everett nodded. I did. The answer surprised her. Because she expected excuses. She expected explanations. She expected him to defend himself. But he didn't. I thought if I removed my name, I would learn who people really were, he said. A pause. But I never stopped to think about what my lie would take from you. Margaret looked back at him. What did it take? Everett lowered his eyes. Your choice. Those two words changed something. Because that was the part she had struggled with most. Not his wealth. Not his identity. Her choice had been taken away. She had helped a man without knowing the whole truth. She had opened her home without knowing who stood before her. Everett continued. I don't expect you to forget. I won't. I know. The honesty in his answer made her quiet. Then he reached into his coat. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. But he did not pull out money. He pulled out a folded letter. The bank sent another notice. She looked at him. How do you know? Because I asked. Her eyes narrowed. I told you I didn't want you fixing my life. I know. Then why? Everett held the letter. Because this isn't about fixing you. He stepped closer but stopped before reaching the porch. It's about giving you the same thing everyone deserves. Margaret waited. A fair chance. She said nothing. Everett continued. I spoke with the bank not to erase your debt, not to buy the ranch. Her eyes stayed on him. I arranged more time. The silence returned. More time. Enough time for you to decide what you want. Margaret looked toward the fields. Not the house. Not him. The land. The place she had fought for. You could have paid everything. Yes. Why didn't you? Everett looked at the ranch. Because then I would be doing the same thing again. Margaret turned back. What do you mean? I would be deciding what happens to your life.